welcome to Theology with Coffee. We are so glad that you're here once again. We are your hosts. My name is Kelson Wolverton.
I'm Taylor Wood, and a child, and this is Casual Conversations about deep biblical truth. And you're blessed on Facebook because you can see us messing around and throwing this pen back and forth, but our podcast listeners are going to be completely confused as to why we're laughing and chuckling here. So anyway, we are back with Revelation, and as we get ready to jump into this, do you have any announcements for us before we get into it?
I apologize if I wasn't here the last episode. My grandma passed away, so that's where I was at. But I bet you it was a fantastic time with the one and only Taylor Wood, as he talked about Daniel chapter 7. So
yeah, speaking of
that out.
The last episode, hopefully you got a chance to catch it.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't, I highly recommend it. And as it's going to become very evident today as we go through this, Daniel chapter 7 from the Old Testament is a very important chapter to Revelation 4 and 5, which we're going to be studying over the next. I'm not going to put a time limit over, as we're going to be studying for some time, Revelation 4 and 5. And so it is very, very, very helpful to understand the flow of Daniel chapter 7 as we come into Revelation chapter 4 and 5. So I'm not going to, here today, or as we study Revelation 4 and 5, go back and go through all of Daniel chapter 7. That's what I did last week.
Right.
And so one thing I might recommend, even though that episode I did last week stands on its own, you don't need to be in Revelation to get Daniel chapter 7. I mentioned Revelation a little bit at the beginning, but most of what I do, I just stick to Daniel 7. So it's kind of a standalone episode, but nevertheless, I would highly recommend, if you haven't listened to it, pause this. If you're not listening to us live, if you're listening on the podcast, pause this, go back and listen to the Daniel 7. It's on Facebook, it's on Spotify, it's on YouTube, all the places to find us. Listen to that and then come back to this, because I really do think it'll be helpful for you to have Daniel chapter 7 rattling around in your mind as we start studying not only chapter 4 and 5, but a lot of the stuff that's going to come up in the rest of the book of Revelation.
Right. And then always feel free to, if it's something we've talked about, or you'd like further detail or questions or comments, we would love to answer them. Maybe, I don't know, sometimes we have people say, hey, this is the next book we would love for you to do. Hey, we're up for suggestions. So you can always comment on Facebook or on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. You can email us at theologywcoffee@gmail.com, and we would love to hear from you.
Yeah. All right. With that, I think it's time for us to jump into this and get going in the next major section here of Revelation. So chapter 4 is not long. In fact, it's about the same length as the letter to Thyatira. And I'm going to read all the way through chapter 4. However, just a fair warning, we may not be able to finish chapter 4 today. I'll also mention this. You'll notice on the episode title I put chapter 4 and 5 part 1. Really, chapter 4 and 5 go together. They are all one scene. And so even though we're not going to finish 4 today, I know me personally, and I'm sure Kelson as well, there will be parts of 5 that we reference because they all pull together. They're all the same kind of scene of what's taking place. So with that as a brief introduction, let me jump in and read chapter 4 to you. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne was 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their head. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, and the second living creature like an ox, and the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. And that finishes up chapter 4. Now, Kelson, just as a brief reminder, John is writing this letter, and this letter of Revelation is directed to the 7 churches that we've just spent several weeks now studying and talking through and discussing. But just as a reminder, what are the circumstances that these churches are going through? I guess what I'm angling at is to what is the purpose that John is writing this letter, the historical circumstances.
Yeah, so ultimately this letter is written to give encouragement, to give hope in times of persecution and hard seasons of life when believers are wanting to give up. And John is writing this letter saying, don't give up, that there is victory for those who are able to conquer, to overcome the obstacle of persecution, of living life here on earth. And there is victory not only eternally for the ones who follow Jesus, but ultimate victory that's going to happen in creation.
Yeah. And as also a reminder of sort of the structure of this book, chapters 1 through 3 serve as an introduction to the book. Not only did he give us this fantastic vision of the Son of God and his glory, but they also give us these different letters to the churches that set for us the themes that we're going to exploring. Now, the real body of the letter, and what I call, and many scholars will call, the apocalypse section. This is the revealing or the opening section of the book. This begins with chapter 4. Chapter 4 and 5, which we're going to be studying over the next few weeks, these are a throne room scene. In fact, our title for our episode today is The Throne Room of God. It is opening up this throne room. And I think it's very appropriate that in this book that is focused on encouraging believers to stay faithful through intense persecution, the opening of the Revelation section of the book starts with not this discussion of the beast and the persecution and the difficult times, but it actually starts with the scene of God and his sovereignty sitting on his throne, being worshiped by those who are loyal to him. Really sets the tone for this book. This is not a book that should scare you. This is not a book that should send you into the cellar to hide, but this is a book of victory, and it is a book that highlights the rule and the victory of our God, right? And chapter 4 and 5 opens this up. What will come after this is an unfolding of 7 different overlapping visions of judgments. We're not there yet, but just understand those judgments are going to be coming after this throne room scene here in chapter 4. Now, before we start digging into the weeds of chapter 4, is there anything else you want to mention as a reminder or as to set up what we're going to be looking at here?
Yeah, no, just a reminder that the chapter 1 through 3, we're actually going to see, just like Taylor said, those themes all throughout the book. You're going to see it quote at the very end of certain things, as well as where we're in chapter 4, especially with the throne room of God being there, but also of Jesus. And so that imagery, the things that we've already talked about, they're going to play pivotal parts where we're going. So just a heads up with that.
Yeah. So this first little section here, I'm actually going to break this up and go through all of verse 1 and then the first little bit of verse 2, where it says, After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit. I'm going to stop there because that's really the introduction to this vision that he is about to witness. Now, what stands out to you about this opening verse and a half here?
Yeah, no, I think it's very poetic because just before with the Church of Laodicea, it talked about, "Behold, I'll stand at the door and knock." And here we are. Behold, the door is standing open. And that choice of, hey, it's open for you to cross, to come to my throne, come up to where I'm at. And not only, it's not physically, it's spiritually, you know what I mean? Of John being able to like come into the throne room. Like nobody can just go into the throne room. Like I think about the tabernacle and the temple, right? That only the high priest once a year at one particular time was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. And that didn't even guarantee his safety, you know, because there had to be a ritual, they had to be whatever. And then the same thing with John, we see it actually with Isaiah, you know, in chapter 6, with Ezekiel, you know what I mean? That's going to be quoted a lot. Even with Moses on Mount Sinai, he had permission to had to go up. It wasn't because of our own doing, it's because of God allowing us to come and to dwell with him, which I think is just a beautiful picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The image of the door opening is this image of revelation being opened up, right? And there's a lot of, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of talk of revelation being sealed up, particularly in the book of Daniel. Well, now here at the beginning of the apocalypse, we have the door being opened. We're going to have an unsealing of a scroll in chapter 5.
Right.
And so we've got this opening up of revelation, this opening up of the will of heaven, the will of God for the earth. But also this image of the open door. I think this is going to tie heavily into this theme that we're going to see unfolding in the book of Revelation, which is the marriage of heaven and earth. Before the door was shut, the gate was closed. We've talked about this also with Jesus being the one who holds the keys to death and Hades. Access to God is shut off. But part of what is going to be accomplished through this revelation is that the way to God is now going to be opened up. The separation that exists, the closed door that exists between heaven and earth, which is of our own doing, of our own sin, that is going to be taken away. The door will be opened so that God's family can be reunited with him, not just in the heavenly space, but in a new heaven and a new earth that are now a merged space, right? And so right here, just with the open door, we're getting like the entire plot line of Revelation all the way through chapter 21. I think that's kind of cool, how he's doing that with this idea of the opening door. So the door is opened up to heaven. And it says, "And the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place.'" Now, if you're reading along in a red letter Bible, this is going to be spoiled for you. But Kelson, who is this that is speaking?
It's Jesus.
And why do we think that?
Yeah, because we're gonna definitely see God, you know, with the elders in the 4th and 5, as well as Jesus come and take his place in chapter 5 as the Lamb. So absolutely, this would be Jesus.
Yeah. It is a little bit interesting because oftentimes in divine visions, there is an angel who plays the part of the guide, so to speak. Here it's Jesus himself, who is the angel of the Lord. But he is playing this role of sort of guide, which is not something we see the Messiah doing often, but here at least, and there's going to be other angelic guides that show up, here at least, it is Jesus Christ who opens the door and invites the prophet in to see what is going to take place. I think there's significance to that. Now it says his voice was like a trumpet. And a couple things I want to say about this. First of all, it doesn't say that a trumpet sounded. That's significant because some eschatological systems make a big deal of this verse, saying that this is the trumpet that sounds and the rapture occurs. But it doesn't actually say that a trumpet sounds here. It says that there is one who has has a voice like a trumpet. And what this actually is another indicator to us that it is God speaking. It is Jesus speaking. And it's another identification that John makes between the Son of God and God himself here. Why do I say that? Well, primarily when we see the voice that is like a trumpet, we are to think back to Exodus.
Right.
We are to think back of God revealing himself at Mount Sinai. Revealing the law, revealing the covenant, revealing his revelation, his constitution that he makes with his people in that place. And that revelation, it is said that there is, his voice is like a trumpet. So here God's voice, or Jesus' voice, is presented as a trumpet, and he is, not for the first time in the book of Revelation, identified with Yahweh himself. And so John is making the statement that Jesus is God, God is Jesus. And this is a very powerful messianic statement that he's making here in this verse at this section. Anything else you want to mention about the trumpet or the voice that speaks?
Yeah, no, that trumpet, you know what I mean? It's Jesus declaring victory. It's declaring warning, right? We've talked about what the shofar and what the trumpet means, as also of praise and of worship. And I also love that, like, John says a lot of like and as, and so he's giving descriptive words, but he cannot tell you exactly it because of how majestic heaven and Jesus and God is, which I just think it just shows the magnificence of like who God and Jesus is, because he cannot, it's as or like those verbs. It's somewhat, but it doesn't give the full visual picture. Like you yourself have to experience the full measure of what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. This trumpet terminology is also, we've discussed this in the context of judgment. Day of the Lord language will often use this idea of the trumpet.
Right.
It's one of those things that ties us back into Day of the Lord prophecies from the Old Testament that we looked at a lot when we did our Minor Prophets series, is this idea of the trumpet. And you made a statement there that I thought was actually very, very interesting because of where I know that I'm going to be going as I look at some of this stuff. But you said that the trumpet sounds both victory and warning.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to get more detail on that? Because we are talking about the shofar. This
Right.
is the specific trumpet. So how does it do both warning but also victory?
Yeah. It's warning because it's declaring, hey, the second coming, the day of the Lord is about to happen, as well as the fact of victory, because we see that the shofar, especially kind of, we talked about this before, but with Rosh Hashanah is the festival of the trumpets, and it's supposed to represent this judgment upon God's enemies, but also victory for the ones who follow him. And so there's this two side-by-side thing, just like the day of the Lord is judgment, it's also deliverance for the ones who follow. And I think the trumpet is a representation of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so already we have this intermingling of deliverance and judgment,
Yep.
victory and warning. We have these ideas being melded together. And again, if you've been keeping up with us, if you've listened to our Minor Prophets, you should immediately be thinking Day of the Lord.
Yeah.
Because these are the themes of the Day of the Lord.
The day of the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. John is kind of pointing us towards this fact that we are now looking at the culmination of
Right.
human history. We're looking at the moment in which the great and terrible day of the Lord, in which God brings human history to an end and initiates a new phase of creation.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So then we get to the actual vision itself. And he says, "At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne room stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne." Now, I'm going to have quite a bit that I want to say about this. I'm going to go into one of my the Taylor monologues
You can
here in a
go
moment.
in your Taylor monologues.
Okay. I just want to see if you want to say
Yeah,
anything before I
no,
jump into that.
You go for it. Yeah.
All right.
I
Well,
can see the excitement on your face.
I am very excited. Daniel chapter 7. It's something that I've done a lot of study of here recently. Obviously, I did an episode on Daniel 7 last week. This vision that we're going to see here in chapter 4 and 5. Daniel chapter 7 provides the backbone for this entire vision that we're going to see here in chapter 4 and 5, this throne room. What do I mean by that? Well, there are other passages that are going to be referenced. Kelson's already mentioned a couple. We're going to see quotations directly from Isaiah chapter 6, directly from Ezekiel chapter 1, directly from Zechariah chapter 4. But the outline that John is following follows closely with Daniel chapter 7. So closely, in fact, that in their book, A Commentary on the New Testament's Use of the New Testament, Beale points out that there are 14 plot points to Daniel chapter 7 that John uses. He uses this kind of outline for how things unfold.
Can I say something real quick?
Yes, please do.
I love that it's 14, because 7 means perfection, but 7 plus 7 is 14, which means perfectly complete.
Yeah.
Which I just think is just great. I just wanted to throw that out there with that number. Yes.
I mean, there's no accident there.
Yes.
To this list of 14.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
So this list of 14, what this is, again, think about this as the structure of chapter 4 and 5. It may not be direct quotes. It may not even be indirect allusions, but it is the structure that John is using for his vision of the throne room, follows along with these 14 points from Daniel chapter 7. Let me give a summary of these. We have an introduction to the vision. We have the setting of a throne or thrones in heaven. We have God sitting on a throne. We have a description of God's appearance on the throne. We have fire before the throne. We have heavenly servants surrounding the throne. We have book or books before the throne. That's the first 7. The next 7, we have the opening of the books. We have the Messiah approaches the throne to receive authority to rule. We have kingdoms, including all peoples, nations, and tongues. We have prophets. We have the prophet disturbed by the vision. We have an angel which provides an explanation. Holy ones are given divine authority. And finally, 14, it is the conclusion of God's eternal reign. Now, this list would be remarkable in and of itself, that John uses these 14 as a framework. What makes it even more remarkable, though, is it shows up in almost exactly the same order. There's a couple points in chapter 5 that John's going to slightly rearrange things to emphasize, but for the most part, he follows, not only does he include these 14 things from Daniel chapter 7, but he also does it in the same order that Daniel unfolds. This is telling us this is more than a coincidence.
Right.
And I think what Daniel is communicating, that the background to Revelation chapter 4 and 5 is the vision of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man that occurs in Daniel chapter 7. Now, I promise you, I'm not going to go all the way through Daniel chapter 7 in this episode. If you want to know more about Daniel chapter 7, I just did it. 55 minutes going through Daniel chapter 7. Please, please, please go check it out from last week. It's really easy to find. It's called The Beast, the Courtroom, and the Kingdom, Daniel chapter 7. Go listen to it. However, just as kind of a broad brushstroke here to help us understand what we're going, what is the vision of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man? Well, at the conclusion of human history, Daniel presents this vision of the Ancient of Days, which is his title that he gives to God the Father, setting up with his angels upon their thrones to cast final judgment upon earth, and in particular, this evil empire and a ruler of this evil empire that has arisen upon the earth and persecuted those who are faithful to God. Okay, faithful to the ways of God. In his judgment of human wickedness, the way in which he accomplishes this is, Daniel says, one like a son of man comes in the clouds, and he is given rule and authority. And so the sense is that the kingdom, the rule and authority, is removed from this evil human king, and it is given to one who is like the Son of Man. And just as Ancient of Days is Daniel's title that he gives to God the Father, one like a Son of Man is Daniel's title that he gives to the Messiah and the Son of God who reigns. Of course, the significance of this is Daniel is telling us that this Son of Man is both God, but he is also human.
Right.
He is truly God and truly human all at once, which is why he is the one who has authority to be both the representative of heaven and the ruler over earth. Now, one final detail that's really important from this is that not only is the Son of Man given this authority in this kingdom, but the holy ones, the people of God, are also rewarded with authority, and they are made brothers and sisters of the great king and co-rulers with the great king at the end. This is significant. And this is a major, major bridge of Old Testament to New Testament, because Daniel chapter 7 is the most explicit passage in the entire Old Testament that says that the members of God's family include not only loyal angels, but also glorified humans who share in the kingdom work along with angels, along with their big brother, the Son of Man. Daniel chapter 7 really provides the framework for how the New Testament is going to talk about what Jesus does for his people, for the church, for Christians. And so Daniel chapter 7 is not just important to Revelation 4 and 5, it's really important to the whole picture of the Bible. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus' favorite title for himself when he's referring to who he is not actually using the term Messiah from the book of Isaiah. He does that, but his primary, the thing that he calls himself the most, is the Son of Man from Daniel. The reason why he does that is, again, Daniel 7 is the most explicit Old Testament passage which talks about what the Messiah is actually going to accomplish through his ministry, which is why Jesus chooses that title more often than any others for himself. Now, I told you that, well, let me hit pause for a second. Anything you want to comment or anything you want to say about any of that? Okay. So I told you that Daniel chapter 7 rolls through this, and I'm going to include this graphic on our YouTube channel, and I'll post it on Facebook so you'll be able to see this. You're just going to have to take my word for it now because you can't see this. But Daniel chapter 7 really rolls through this vision and goes through these different elements of the vision and include these 14 that I mentioned earlier. Revelation 4 and 5 does the same thing, and as I said before, almost exactly in the same order that Daniel does, to the point that we have the culmination of Revelation chapter 5 is we're going to see that the holy ones, the faithful of God, are given authority along with Jesus Christ, and God's eternal reign is celebrated and worshiped there in Daniel chapter 7. So, let me just say this again after providing those references. The significance of this is that even though John is going to reference other Old Testament passages, Daniel chapter 7 is the outline that he's using. As he's writing chapter 4 and 5, he is writing it in such a way that it reflects the flow and the points and the climax of Daniel chapter 7. Okay? He's going to use Daniel chapter 7 later in the book, but this really, I think he's tipping his hand and he's telling you, hey, what I'm doing is I'm taking the vision of Daniel chapter 7 and I'm now expanding it, and I'm telling you how this applies to this thing called the church. What does Daniel chapter 7 mean after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
And how is Daniel 7 going to now play out now that Jesus Christ has been crucified, has spent 3 days in the grave, has been resurrected, and has ascended to heaven? So, again, I'm going to hit pause.
Yeah.
What are your reactions to that? Any thoughts on any of that
Yeah,
stuff?
no, we actually see with even some of the churches that John has expressed, he talks about how God's people will rule with Jesus. Like, you know what I mean? Not only with Daniel chapter 7, John's already introduced that already with if the churches as a whole are able to conquer, this is the rewards that are going to happen. And so even John has mentioned that not only in chapter 1 but chapter 2 and chapter 3, and is already lining that up perfectly. So
yeah. Now, believe it or not, this actually opens up a door for us to talk about chronology.
Right.
Okay. So when do these specific things take place? And really what I'm angling at here, as we're putting together a timeline of the eschaton, as we're putting together a timeline of how God is going to bring about the day of the Lord, where does chapter 4 and 5 fit into that timeline? And believe it or not, this is actually a topic that is fraught with difficulties. Okay, so to begin with, many of your traditional views, traditional premillennial views, especially dispensational premillennial views. So think here, again, I know you may be unfamiliar with those terms, but think here about the Left Behind series. Think here about Bible teachers like David Jeremiah, many other pastors and Bible teachers and prophecy people who have this very literal view of a 7-year tribulation followed by a 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, and somewhere in there we have a rapture. Okay, so with that view, oftentimes chapter 4 and 5 of Revelation are put at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation.
Right.
Okay. So in other words, they say that the 7-year tribulation, the last 7 years of human history, will be initiated by what happens here in chapter 4 and 5. Now, if you are a dispensational premillennialist, and what that means, basically that means you're going to believe in a tribulation rapture. Okay, if you take a pre-tribulation rapture, you're actually going to view chapter 4 as being what happens right after the rapture. So in your mind, the rapture occurs, even though the rapture is not mentioned once in Revelation. In your mind, the rapture occurs between chapter 3 and chapter 4. The church disappears, and the church is now in the presence of God here in chapter 4 and 5. No believers are left on earth for what occurs after chapter 5, beginning with the judgments that play out in chapter 6.
Right.
So if we're talking about chronology and you are premillennial, in particular if you are dispensational premillennial, you would say that chapter 4 and 5 occur at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, and that the rapture has occurred between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Now, do you have any comments or questions? Was I clear on that, or did I fumble anything?
No, you didn't fumble anything.
Okay.
At all.
Now, this view is going to be critiqued by especially those who are amillennial. Again, that term may be very unfamiliar to you.
Millennial?
Amillennials.
Like,
that's millennial with an A in
with
front.
an A in front.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah. I was, I'm like,
Yeah.
as in like AW, or like like kind of O,
I
A.
know.
Okay.
By the way, one of the most frustrating parts about studying Revelation is that the Revelation systems are all they're amillennial, post-millennial, premillennial, and then there's like 50 different premillennial positions. The frustrating part about that is you get no mention of the millennium until Revelation chapter 20. And so like when you're doing what we're doing and you're going verse by verse and you're going through it, you can't even really discuss the millennium until you get to the very end of the book. And yet you're using terms like pre, post, millennial to describe these different positions, even though someone who has no background whatsoever in Revelation is going to be completely confused. Right?
Yeah.
So premillennial, chapter 4 and 5 occur at the beginning of a 7-year tribulation, or if you're non-literal, some period of tribulation that lasts a period of time. Okay, so 7 being a symbolic number. Both of those are going to be very similar positions in that sense. If you're amillennial, that's A with the word millennial coming after it. And by the way, the prefix a means not. You don't believe in a literal millennium. In fact, an amillennial position would be that we are currently in the millennium, that there is no millennium that comes after the return of Christ, but in fact, the millennium is currently going on right now. Okay, you would critique the idea that chapter 4 and 5 occur before the 7-year tribulation. The reason why you would do that is especially in chapter 5, when you have this vision of the slaughtered lamb that is presented to Jesus
Right.
to before God, before the throne of God. And the slaughtered lamb now rules and takes his kingdom. You would say, that sure sounds like the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, doesn't it? Right? That sure sounds like the fulfillment of Psalm chapter 2 and the fulfillment of Psalm 110 and the fulfillment of what Hebrews talks about with the Son of Man,
Right.
with the Messiah, the Son of God, taking his seat next to his Father, which occurs not in connection with the tribulation, but actually occurs in connection with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so as you read chapter 4 and 5, your chronology, you're not going to connect chapter 4 and 5 with the tribulation whatsoever. You're actually going to say that chapter 4 and 5 has already occurred, and this actually occurred with the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. Your whole interpretation of the throne room scene then is going to be flavored as not what has not yet occurred, but what has already occurred, right?
Okay.
So that's going to be where an all-millennial is going to take this. We already have two completely disparate views of chronology.
Right.
But get ready because it gets worse. Because remember how I told you that this whole thing is an outline of Daniel chapter 7? That John is wanting you to think about Daniel chapter 7?
Right.
Well, here's a big problem with that. In Daniel chapter 7, the presentation of the Son of Man to Yahweh is something that doesn't occur with the death and resurrection and the first coming of Jesus
Right.
Christ. And it doesn't occur at the beginning of the tribulation. This is what occurs at the end of the tribulation when the Son of Man returns, with the second coming of Jesus Christ to put an end to the beast and evil. Okay? So you have John using Daniel chapter 7, but he is now shifting it to be something that doesn't occur after, if we read Revelation as sort of A, B, C, D. It's not something that's occurring after the second coming of Jesus Christ, but it's actually something that's occurring before the second coming of Jesus Christ. In fact, before the revelation of the beast, which initiates the whole tribulation. Okay? Here's my point. Whatever chronology you choose, the Bible is thumbing its nose at you and saying, nope, you can't do that. Okay? It should caution you against being dogmatic on any system that you're going to go with. This is something that Kelson and I have talked about before, especially with our discussion of the Day of the Lord theology.
Right.
The Bible refuses to fit into man-made systems.
Correct.
Okay? Every system you come up with, whether it's premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, whether it's dispensationalism, whether it's pre-tribulation rapture, post-tribulation rapture, whatever system you come up with, you bring this to me and show me 3 passages that prove it. I'm going to show you 36 passages that seem to disprove it. Okay? Whichever one you do. So what's the point? The point is that you need to throw your system out.
Right.
You need to stop trying to fit the Bible into the chronology of your favorite prophecy teacher, and we need to read God's word, and we need to take God's word at face value.
Right.
Okay? We need to just read with a mind for biblical theology, not for a mind of systematic theology, in particular when it comes to eschatology.
Right.
All right? We need to keep the first things first. We need to major in the majors and stop trying to fit God's word into timelines that are probably all wrong to some degree.
Absolutely. Because even Jesus didn't even know when he was on earth what time was coming. You know what I mean? So if like Jesus, the Son of God, didn't know, how is it that we're trying to figure that out ourselves in the timeline? Because that's not how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, something does need to be said here, because I did introduce something that could be very challenging. I don't care as much about, and we're going to get into this as we continue to study chapter 4 and 5. Is this talking about a resurrection scene, in which case you're going to lean more towards amillennialism? Is this talking about a pre-tribulation, in which case you're going to lean much more towards the premillennial view? We'll talk more about that. But I do need to say something about this apparent disconnect between Daniel, which I interpreted last week, and I think very clearly is an end-of-age passage with the second coming of Jesus Christ, and Revelation 4 and 5, which is going to be presenting the slaughtered lamb. here as something that occurs before the tribulation. Before I comment, do you want to talk a little bit about that? What might, because clearly Daniel 7 is behind what's going on here.
Right.
So why do you think John is taking Daniel 7, something that refers to the second coming of Jesus Christ, and now moving it forward in the book of Revelation away from chapter 19 and 20 where Jesus returns?
I think it kind of goes back with that whole day of the Lord and that trumpet of that we're seeing the victory happen first and then the judgment and the wrath that's coming, where Daniel did the wrath, but then there was also the victory. And so I think those two go hand in hand. And John is eloquently, I think, trying to say that in itself once again.
In that sense, with Revelation 4 and 5 and Daniel 7,
Daniel
you
7.
have this already but not yet aspect, right?
Correct.
You have what Jesus Christ has already accomplished through his death, burial, and resurrection. You have an inauguration of the kingdom, but you do not have a completion or a culmination of that kingdom until the second coming of Jesus Christ. And both Daniel 7 and Revelation 4 and 5 are going to reflect that already but not yet eschatology, right? And I think that's a basic. The other thing is that Revelation, if you're used to reading Revelation as a timeline, this should be a big indicator that you're going to be struggling to fit Revelation into a timeline. Okay, and this is almost entirely to my premillennial Left Behind brothers and sisters, people who just think that the Left Behind is the revelation from God, and that's exactly how it's going to play out. Okay, Left Behind takes a very, very idiosyncratic view of Revelation that views, starting in chapter 4, views everything that happens in Revelation as a perfect sequence. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. If you read Revelation carefully, what you're going to find out is that Revelation is constantly breaking off that sequence. Revelation is looping back on itself. Revelation is repeating ideas upon itself. This is sometimes something that's called recapitulation. This is the idea that Revelation doesn't play out as a sequence of A to B to C to D, but actually plays out as a series of loops that loops in on itself. And each time you loop through, it reveals something deeper, something new. It goes a little bit deeper.
What's the word again?
Recapitulation.
Wow. Okay.
Is the theological term
the
there.
theological term.
Yeah. And I apologize. I don't want to make this, like insider baseball to where you need to know all these terms.
I just wanted you to say that word again, because even I didn't even know that word. So I was just wanting for them to know as well as myself.
And you're going to run, if you do any serious reading in Revelation, you're going to run into terms like this. You're going to run into millennial views. You're going to run into, again, this idea of recapitulation. But just basically, this is the idea that Revelation is not playing out as this sequence of events, but in fact, Revelation is looping in around on itself. If we take that view, then and if we have this idea that Revelation 4 and 5, the chronology of this is describing things that are both already but also not yet, then we have this view that Revelation 4 and 5 is not something that we need to be sticking on a timeline. We don't need to be figuring out a chronology. But the throne room scene of Revelation 4 and 5 is in fact a picture of God's sovereignty over all of history. So has Revelation 4 and 5 already occurred? Yes.
Yes.
Is Revelation 4 and 5 describing something that has not yet occurred? Yes.
Yes.
Is Revelation 4 and 5 describing things that are happening right now? Yes. All of this is true. Because the point of Revelation 4 and 5 is not that it's doing a single scene that occurs in a sequence of events. Revelation 4 and 5, I believe, is an umbrella over everything that's going to occur in this vision that is describing God's sovereignty and God's will being worked out from the moment of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection all the way to the end of history. Okay? And so that's why I think we're getting here in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. That's a lot of words for me basically say, be careful with systems, right? Be careful with chronology. Because if you read Revelation carefully, it's always going to refuse to fit neatly into the whatever eschatological system your favorite Bible prophecy teacher is using.
I was just thinking it'd probably be good to like have a list of all those things that you said and like us write kind of a summary.
Probably
so that they would know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It
kind
just
of a
breaks it up.
glossary of terms.
Yes, exactly. And so then they can have that, put that in their Bible, their journal, or so on
Yeah,
and so
we
forth.
can definitely work on that and we can post that.
Yeah.
So-
So, because I think that'd be really good. But yeah.
All right.
Uh-huh.
Well, very good. We're still in chapter or verse 2 here. So Kelson, but I had to get a lot of that out of the way because a lot of that's going to flavor what we're talking about here in the rest of chapter 4 and 5.
Right. Well, and it goes back, we talked about in the overview that depending on what view you take is how you're going to read Revelation. And I think you eloquently put it well of the fact that 4 and 5, it's the yes, it's already happened. It is happening now, and it hasn't happened. And that ultimately, this is God's sovereignty over what is and who is and what is to come, right? That description of who he is. So I think that was good.
Yeah. As we move on in verse 2, it says, "A throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald." Now let me stop there because here in verse 2 and 3 we have several very vibrant images of this scene. So what's going on here in verse 2 and 3?
Yeah. John is seeing the throne and the one seated on the throne. This is talking about God himself. And I love the imagery of the gemstones and how each one plays like in its beautiful, perfect thing of that jasper. It's green, but they say when you shine it, it's so crystal clear. It just sparkles. It radiates who that is. And it goes back to that picture, I think, of holiness. That means set apart. That nothing, right? Like sin, wrath, nothing can come into that holiness because of how perfect and beautiful, just like jasper is when it's clean. And that carnelian, it's a red, like a bright but yet warm, dark red. And I think it's supposed to represent also God's judgment, God's wrath, right, of that carnelian. They say that even watching that, it pictures like little parts that it looks like fire in the gemstone. And I think it's supposed to represent God's even wrath. Again, talk about that day of the Lord language, right? Deliverance and judgment. Here we have God's holiness, but also God's wrath and how that plays in a part of who he is. So I can go more, but I didn't
Please
know if you
do. Yeah.
wanted to say anything else. And then around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. And I think it's, some people say, yeah, the rainbow, but another word could be the hollow. It's this crown, this shining bright of who God is. And I just think it's a great picture because I think even John is going back to Genesis chapter 6 and with 9 of that covenant that God would never flood the earth again, that he made his promise, his covenant, and so on and so forth, that we're seeing his covenant, that Jesus will come back again. And I just think that is so beautiful. And this appearance of an emerald, again, it's kind of a greenish, but yet it's also white. And I think about what we've already talked about with the white robes of purity, of righteousness that will be bestowed on God's people as we co-rule together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like that you brought out this idea of connecting this rainbow here with Genesis 6 through 9. Now, there is a lot that shows up here that is a specific reference to Ezekiel chapter 1. Okay, you mentioned these precious stones. I thought this was really interesting. Precious stones actually aren't associated with the throne of God very often.
Yeah.
In fact, if my reading is correct, the only other place it shows up is Ezekiel chapter 1.
I believe that is correct. Yes.
And I mean, that's just very curious to me. I mean, one, it says, again, that's not an accident. John knows what he's doing. But I find it curious that this idea of precious stones, which often are used to represent the tribes of Israel, that is an area where precious stones comes up a lot.
Right.
But Ezekiel is using this idea of the precious stones to talk about the glory and the radiance and capture all these different facets of his nature. John then picks up and uses that as well. Now, the other interesting thing about these precious stones is there's one other place where they play a prominent role, which is in chapter 21 when John describes the New Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, he actually repeats several of these when he's going through them. The carnelian, the jasper, these show up again in Revelation chapter 21. And I think there's a really cool image there where here in chapter 4, we still have this separation between heaven and earth.
Right.
We have God's throne room and God's reign as being distinct from what's going on earth. But when we get to the new heavens and the new earth, when we get to the city of Jerusalem, all of a sudden the glory of God has been merged now, and the throne of God, there is no distinction between heaven and earth. They are the same realm.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking, because I've been going through the temple with the youth, and how even that's just a beautiful picture because Jesus towards the veil, that the Holy of Holies and the holy place had separation, and yet the temple itself became one. And then so much so that the temple is now in us, of Jesus dwelling with us. And then now we're going to see a new temple, which is that heaven and earth are not separated, but they merge and become one in eternity of what the garden, the representation is.
Yeah. And it is a return to Eden, but it is even an expansion of Eden.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too much into that. We're not in chapter 21 yet. So, in 2025, whenever we get to chapter 21 or whatever, I'll talk more about that. But just keep in mind, when God created the earth in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. The Garden of Eden served as his temple on this earth, but mankind was to spread across the earth and bring the glory of God to the whole earth.
Right.
And so that gets lost with sin, but sometimes we have this idea that the Garden of Eden covered the entire earth. It didn't. The Garden of Eden was a section. It was a sacred section within the wider creation.
Yeah.
And the job of God's human family was to take Eden and expand it across the whole earth.
Right.
That doesn't get fulfilled until we have the new heavens and the new earth. And Revelation 4 and 5 is now initiating, it is inaugurating the process that is going to bring about that expansion, that first restoration of Eden, and then that expansion of Eden.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Now, the rainbow, because what kicked all this off was you mentioning the rainbow.
Yes.
This is another connection with Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel, interestingly enough, says an emerald rainbow extends out from the throne of God. And I think he talks about it circling the throne of God while John has it extending out.
Yeah.
The distinction there really isn't that important. They're both using this rainbow image. But I do agree with you. I think both John and Ezekiel are actually reaching back, surprisingly, to the story of Genesis 6 through 9.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I taught whenever I did through my Genesis series is I taught about how Genesis 6 through 9, the Noah and flood story, is actually a messianic story.
Yeah.
We don't see it a lot of times, but there's a lot of messianic overlaps between Noah and the flood and what occurs with the ministry of Jesus Christ. Well, here we're getting this day of the Lord overlap. Okay, just as the rainbow is a picture of God's promise that there will be a remnant and that he will never destroy the earth again through water. Okay, so it is, the rainbow is both a picture of God's judgment, but also a picture of God's deliverance. So we see here the rainbow now at the beginning of Revelation, coming from the throne of God, is a picture of the fact that judgment is coming. And just like the flood, it's not going to be through water this time, but just like with the flood, there is going to be this judgment, but there's also going to be this deliverance that takes place.
Yeah.
And God himself is going to be the agent of that deliverance.
Absolutely. And I just love the rainbow had 7 colors. Again, right? The number 7. Very significant. Yeah.
Yeah. Then, so from, I'm sorry, I mixed that up. So it's actually Revelation where the rainbow is emerald.
Right.
And it's Ezekiel where it's just a normal rainbow. Okay. And again, I don't know if you see any significance with this idea of the emerald, the green. Do you see any kind of significance there between that slight difference between Revelation and Ezekiel?
The only thing I can think of is that maybe that emerald, that green represents creation, right? Nature, like that number 4. And I think it's, there was just a rainbow with Ezekiel, but John is going back to that. This emerald green is going to be that new restoration of the garden, the new Eden, that it's just going to be blossomed and radiate compared to not just a rainbow, but the rainbow itself will just overpower, you know what I mean? Just like creation in itself. Yeah.
To me, I think the only, I don't see any significant symbolism there. I think the only thing you might have, what might be going on in the background of this is John is basically just trying to continue this image of the precious stones, which is why he takes that emerald and says it's not just a rainbow, it's a rainbow made of emerald, okay, in the same way that he's already used these precious stones. But again, the point of this is not necessarily to take it literal.
No.
These are symbols. These are representative with these precious stones, as you laid out, of these different facets of the character of God.
Right. And again, allowing, as Bruce Metzger says, this disciplined imagination, because literally John is bringing, as you can see, and we're going to continue, beautiful imagery and poeticness and filled with song and of praise and of worship. And that we can understand some of it, but at the same time, we're not going to understand the fullness of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what I want to do, because I think we're going to need to wrap this up real soon.
Okay.
So what I want to do is I actually want to skip verse 4, which talks about the 24 thrones and the 24 elders.
Okay.
This is actually one of the more difficult. This is one of the things that John sort of, he doesn't have a clear Old Testament reference to the 24 elders.
And there's lots of different point of views of the 24 elders.
And I think that in of itself, I mean, that in of itself could possibly be a whole episode in discussion. So I want to skip that for now.
Okay.
And I want to get into that next week.
Okay.
But what I want to do is I do want to continue to look at this sort of theophany. That's another big theological word, but a theophany is a picture of God, right? Because it continues to describe, and it says, from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumbling and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God, and before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. So, concluding this image of God's throne and his glory, we get 3 more images. Okay, so we have the images, we have the storm, we have this image of the 7 fires, and finally we have this image of the sea of glass. Let's take each of those and comment on each of those. So first of all, let's talk about the storm. What is the significance here of the storm?
Yeah, no, we see a few times of the storm coming, like I think about when God dwells on Mount Sinai. There was a rumbling. There was a storm. I also
so that's probably the first and most significant.
Yes.
All other references of storms build off the Sinai storm.
Yes.
Right. They all kind of have that idea in their images of the thunder clouds of God descending upon Mount Sinai when the covenant is given. So
yeah, absolutely. I also think of the story with found in Joshua, as Joshua and the people of Israel are going into the promised land, where God shows up and he builds a storm against the Canaanites, and he brings down like rocks, from the heavens. And I think that's another form of God in his presence and showing himself, hey, like, I'm in control of all things. I also think it's also this reference too of we've been talking about the spiritual warfare that's happening. And what was Baal? Baal was the god of storm, the god of rumbling. And here, I love that picture because the Romans, especially during this time, with the church and the Domitian, they would represent Baal, Zeus. All those people was the god of storm, of lightning. And here God is saying, I'm the storm of lightning and rumbling.
Zeus is a comparable god to Baal.
Yeah.
And so just as in the Old Testament, Baal is one of the chief rivals to God, now as we get into the New Testament, in particular the Gentile church here in Asia Minor, it is Zeus who is a chief rival of God. And this is not the first time that we've seen John use images as a polemic against Zeus.
Yeah.
He's taken things that are said about Zeus and say, well, actually it's Yahweh. You think Zeus is in charge of this, but just as Baal was defeated by Yahweh, Zeus is also lower than and defeated by Yahweh. And I agree with you. I think that this has that as a background to it.
Yeah. So we also see that with, I think it too of like with the storm with Elijah, you know what I mean? Like there was so much drought. And as Elijah has his sacrifice to the Lord, and then the prophets of Baal, what did God bring? He brought fire upon the thing, but then he brought water and restoration, the storm that brought life into being again with Elijah. And then First Kings with the judgment of Ahab, that there would be a storm. And so we see several examples of how God is showing his sovereignty, of his almightiness, his covenant, his presence. But again, I think that side thing of it's also his wrath instead of his judgment, and that he brings it into the storm.
Yeah. So you kind of got there, but in Day of the Lord theology, I think specifically both the book of Joel and the book of Hosea, when they discuss the Day of the Lord, they associate the Day of the Lord with this coming storm. Okay, the storm really represents this unmaking of God's creation.
Right.
There's nothing more chaotic than a storm, and it is God who commands the storm and uses the storm to unmake what has been made, right? And so we do have this literal rolling back of the scrolls of creation, this tearing apart of creation here as the throne of God is now being manifest in the heavens above and on the earth below. The other thing I thought of, and this is a little bit more of an obscure reference, and is I think about the book of Job. Because at the end of the book of Job, when God reveals himself to Job, he reveals himself in the storm. And there's this climactic scene at the very end of Job where the storm thunders in. And of course, Job, it has all these different characters arguing back and forth. And the moment when God thunders from the storm and speaks, everyone else gets quiet. Everyone falls silent. And no one can speak when God arrives and begins to speak and give his answer to what's going on in the book of Job. And you do see something similar here in Revelation, right?
Yeah.
For all the chaos that's going on in the world, God arrives and it silences it as God brings about his voice, his thundering voice to bring, to declare what is going to happen, and no one can defy it.
And I just thought about Jesus, right, on the boat when there's the storm happening and it's chaotic. But when Jesus spoke, there was silence and there was brought peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the second image is that of the seven torches of fire, which are the seven spirits of God. And again, I think you and I are basically going to come to the same conclusion on this particular point. There's a background here in Zechariah chapter 4 with the seven lampstands. I'd encourage you to go look at that. We've actually already looked at that because in my mind, I'm sure you're going to agree with me on this, we've already seen these figures of the seven torches. So do you disagree with me that these are these same seven angels?
No, I don't disagree.
Yeah, so these are heavenly beings. These
Heavenly
are more
beings.
divine beings. Just like the 24 elders and just like the 4 living creatures, these are members of the council of God.
Yeah.
Another option to this, you could see this, many people have seen this as a reference to the heavenly menorah, and you might have the kavod, or the glory of God, being manifest here. But again, given the fact of angels in Psalm 104, angels are constantly tied to the idea of fire. Given the fact that you have this reference of the seven spirits, you've already had these spirits showing up earlier in the book of Revelation. These angels, again, I think whether you take it as literal or non-literal, you have a representation here of angelic beings before the throne of God, right?
Right.
Okay. And then finally we have, and before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And we get another reference here to Ezekiel chapter 1. Okay. Again, Daniel chapter 7 provides the outline, but there's a lot of references in these two chapters to Ezekiel chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 6. This is just another one. And so we have the sea of glass that is extending out before the throne. In Ezekiel chapter 1, I don't have it open in front of me, but I believe it says that there is a crystal expanse that is above the throne, and that the throne actually, it's tied to the throne, and sort of the throne is suspended from this crystal expanse above it.
You know where else it's mentioned?
Where?
In Exodus.
Okay, now
Okay.
that's interesting.
And I need to find it, but it's where Moses is with the people, and they're doing the sacrifice, whatever, and he takes 24 of the tribes of the elders up to Mount Sinai with him, and they see a glimpse of God's heavenly of land of sea of grass like crystal. Which I just think is just so cool.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's another example, and we see that in Exodus.
Yeah.
And I think that's a point into this right now. Kind
Yeah.
of that Mount Sinai, not just Ezekiel and Daniel, but also like with God's people, you know, in Exodus.
And interestingly enough, that's actually going to play on our discussion of who the 24 elders are here as well, whenever we get to that next week. So, yeah, that's a passage there. It's another one of these divine appearance passages that seems to be in the back of John's mind as he's looking at that. Now, the sea in and of itself is very interesting. I mentioned to you before about Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, the sea is a place of evil and chaos.
Right.
And indeed, as you look at most of the Old Testament references to the sea is not a good place. And so it's a little bit surprising to have the sea, which is a place where demonic spirits come out of. It is a place that God must subdue, that God must control. The sea is often portrayed as the enemy of God. It is interesting to have the sea now being associated with the throne room of God. Now, I have my theory as to why this is, but I didn't know if you ran into any discussion on this connection with the sea, which traditionally is associated with evil, yes, but more broadly than evil, chaos, right? And it is God who must still and control chaos in order for life to exist. So I don't know if you ran into anything that has this discussion.
No, I did not.
Okay, well, here's my theory. Both Ezekiel and John here describe this sea or this expanse as being glass or crystal. Now, what's going on here? Perhaps they also, like Daniel, are viewing the sea as something that is chaotic. And John's even going to use that later on. The dragon is going to stand on the banks of the sea and call forth the beast from the sea. And another reference to Daniel chapter 7. And the sea is where the beast, human evil, comes from the sea in Daniel chapter 7. So perhaps what he's doing here is he's talking about how, where generally speaking, we think of the sea as this tumultuous, this ever-changing, this chaotic place, this place that births devastation across the earth. In John's mind, God, as he takes his throne and as the council sits, even the chaos of the sea is stilled. And it is as if the raging sea has now become as still and as calm as glass. And again, imagine that picture. If you've ever been to the ocean or to the sea, you know how loud the waves are. You know how powerful the waves are. And imagine God showing up, and the moment he speaks, instead of the ocean going up and down and back and forth, now it gets still, as if it's made of glass itself. It's almost as though even the sea cannot resist the authority and the sovereignty of God. That's how massively powerful he is. And so the sea is chaos, but it is God who stills the chaos and who brings order to that which is disordered. And that might be the image behind the crystal sea here.
You can continue. Sorry.
Well,
I'm writing my own notes.
I'm pretty much done. So that would be my explanation of the sea of crystal there, why John uses that image. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that. Okay.
I think it's good.
Well, with that, I do think this is a good place to stop. And I know we only got through 6 verses. Technically, we didn't even get to that many because we skipped 4. But what I want to do next week is I want to start with our discussion with really talking about this idea of the council room of God. What is the council of God? Because we're going to see this is very important.
Absolutely.
And then we're going to get into some really fun stuff as we talk about who these 24 elders, and after this, the 4 living creatures, what role they're playing. Because as Kelson said, there's quite a bit of different debate over this. Maybe we'll disagree.
You know, it could happen. It has happened before.
I thought for sure we were going to disagree on the 7 spirits of God,
Well,
and
he was
we've been in
wrong.
lockstep on that one. So we'll see on that. I think that'll be a really fun discussion. Anything you want to say to kind of wrap up, close up? We'll save our applications,
Right.
but anything broadly you want to speak of?
Yeah, no, just continue to read. I would encourage, not only read Daniel chapter 7, but maybe read Ezekiel 1.
Ezekiel
Read
1 and Isaiah 6.
I think are really pivotal. Even probably read Exodus, right? With the story. With
Just read the
Moses.
Bible.
Yeah, all of it.
Just read all of it
All of it's
before
so
next week.
important. Yeah, exactly. But I just encourage to just like look at those passages, kind of get familiar, so that when we do come back and talk about those things, you're going to have some background foundation for you to understand. And again, how John is not taking new concepts, he's taking everything back from the Old Testament and the New Testament of what Jesus has already said, which really just shows that, like, hey, reading our Bible is really important and to understand his gospel. And it's not hard to understand if you're taking time to intentionally be in his word and go to church and learning and discipling and theologically working together. That's why we created Theology with Coffee. It's just that simple. And so my encouragement is to continue to just do that.
Yeah.
And then pray for the Spirit to reveal insight and information about what he wants for you, as you read it.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really do appreciate it. Whatever platform you're watching us, be sure to like, subscribe,
listening.
give a star, give a thumbs up, whatever that platform does.
Heart?
A
I don't
heart.
know.
We have no idea. And be sure to follow us so that you can always stay up to date.